The first time his plane went down, he crawled out of burning wreckage and asked for another aircraft. The second time, they found him in enemy territory, alone, wounded, still breathing. The third time, his commanding officers stopped betting on his survival. The fourth time, even he stopped believing he would make it home. But the fifth time, that was the one that changed everything. Not because it finally killed him, but because of what he did after. Welcome, and thank you for being here, to WWII Ghost Wings. This is a channel built for those who believe that real history, the kind written in blood, fire, and unbreakable human, deserves to be told with the respect it earned. If this is the first time joining us here, a very warm welcome, and if returning, it is always good to have you back. For those who have not yet subscribed, there is a small red button just below this video. One quiet click, and these stories will always find their way to you. No story like this one should ever be missed. A quick question before beginning. Where in the world is this being watched from right now? Drop the country or city down in the comments. It is always remarkable to see how far these stories travel. And if real history, the kind that most textbooks never dare to tell, strikes a chord today, a like on this video means more than one might think. It helps this story reach someone else who needs to hear it. The bell notification, just a small tap, and nothing will ever be missed. Now the story begins. Somewhere over occupied Europe, a young man is learning that the sky is not a place of freedom. It is a place of execution. The year is 1943. The war has already swallowed a generation. On the ground, armies move across burned earth and shattered cities. But above it all, in the thin, freezing air where clouds become cover and sunlight becomes a weapon, a different kind of war is being fought. Faster, quieter, and far more merciless. Aerial combat in the Second World War was not a contest of courage alone. It was a contest of mathematics, of odds, of probability measured in seconds and altitude and the angle of an enemy's guns. The numbers were brutal and indifferent. In certain theaters of war, the average combat pilot survived fewer than 15 missions before his aircraft, and everything inside it was gone. 15 missions. Some did not survive 5. Into this world stepped a man whose name, at the time, meant nothing to history. He was not a general, not a strategist, not the son of someone powerful. He was a young man from ordinary ground who had looked up at the sky long before the war began and seen something in it that others simply could not see. He trained hard. He studied mechanics of flight with the focus of someone who understood, perhaps instinctively, that knowledge was the only armor that mattered at 30,000 feet. His instructors noted his precision, his calmness under pressure, the particular stillness that settled over him when conditions deteriorated around everyone else. But training prepared a man for flying. Nothing prepared a man for what was coming. By the time his first real combat mission was complete, he had already witnessed things that rewired the circuitry of ordinary human fear. Friends who had eaten breakfast beside him that morning were gone before the sun moved 2 hours across the sky. Aircraft reduced to smoke and silence. The war above the clouds operated on a speed that the mind could barely process, and yet the body had no choice but to respond. He responded every single time. That response, that relentless, almost irrational refusal to stop, is what the story is built upon. If this story is already pulling at something, that instinct that recognizes real history when it lands, go ahead and give this video a like, and share it with someone who appreciates the kind of courage that numbers alone can never explain. They did not ground him after the first time. They should have. A parachute does not care who is wearing it. It does not distinguish between the decorated and the forgotten, between the experienced and the raw. It opens or does not. And in the winter skies over occupied Europe, the difference between those two outcomes was measured not in skill or bravery, but in the cold arithmetic of luck. His first shoot down was not dramatic, in a way that war movies manufacture drama. There was no slow-motion spiral, no final heroic radio transmission. There was enemy fire, precise, sudden, and unannounced. And then there was a cockpit filling with smoke, a control panel that no longer responded, and a decision that had to be made in the space between one heartbeat and the next. He got out. He always got out. The second incident came from a direction no training exercise had ever simulated. Not enemy guns this time, but a catastrophic mechanical failure at the precise moment his aircraft entered the most vulnerable position in any aerial engagement. The sky, which pilots often describe in letters home as peaceful and vast, became in that instant a closing trap with no visible exit. He found one anyway. By the third shoot-down, something had begun to shift, not in him, but in the people around him. Ground crews spoke about him in particular low tones, reserved for men the war seemed unwilling to claim. Officers reviewed his incident reports with an expression that sat somewhere between professional concern and something closer to superstition. In the rigid, unsentimental machinery of military command, this pilot had become an anomaly that the paperwork could not comfortably contain. He was grounded briefly after the third, then cleared to fly again. That decision, made by men sitting at desks far from the altitude where the consequences lived, would matter enormously before the story reached its end. The fourth shoot-down stripped away whatever remained a statistical coincidence. This was no longer a pattern that luck could explain. Something in this man's constitution, his reflexes, his psychology, the specific way his mind processed mortal danger, was operating outside the boundaries of what military science at the time understood about human performance under sustained combat stress. He came back from the fourth with injuries that should have ended his flying career permanently. He filed his report. He asked when he could return to his aircraft. The fifth time was waiting, and unlike the four before it, the fifth time had a different ending in mind. History does not always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives as a flash of light, a sound that comes after the impact, and a silence that follows both. The morning of the fifth shoot-down began like every other morning the war had produced. Cold air, engine checks, a briefing delivered in the flat, efficient language that military necessity had long since stripped of emotion. Men stood around maps and studied coordinates, as though the lines drawn on paper bore any honest resemblance to the chaos waiting above the clouds. He took his position. He lifted off. What happened next unfolded not over hours, but over minutes, perhaps less. Combat at altitude operates on a timescale that the grounded mind cannot instinctively grasp. Decisions that would take an ordinary person several seconds of careful thought must be executed in fractions, in the space between perception and consequence where training either holds or does not. The attack came from above. In aerial warfare, altitude is everything. It is gravity weaponized. An enemy with height has speed, angle, and the fundamental advantage of dictating the terms of engagement before the targeted pilot even registers a threat. His aircraft absorbed the impact in the section that mattered most. Not the wings, not the tail, but the systems that govern whether a pilot retained any control at all. He retained almost none. The descent was not a glide. It was a controlled catastrophe. A man fighting with broken instruments, a wounded aircraft, and a body that was itself beginning to register the cost of the engagement. The ground below was not friendly. The territory beneath his failing aircraft was occupied, monitored, and hostile in every direction a compass could point. And yet, the mind that had processed four previous near deaths did not fracture. It narrowed. Survivors of extreme combat stress often describe the same phenomenon. A strange impression of thought that eliminates everything non-essential and focuses what remains into a single, burning point of clarity. Fear does not disappear in those moments. It transforms. It becomes fuel rather than paralysis. He used every drop of it. The landing, if it could be called that, was violent enough to end most stories permanently. What followed was a period of evasion, injury, and isolation that tested not the pilot in him, but the human being beneath the uniform. Alone in hostile territory, wounded in ways that would not fully surface until long after the war ended. He made decisions that spoke to a depth of character that no flight school had ever been designed to cultivate. He survived. Again. But this time, survival had extracted a price that no medal could adequately acknowledge, and no military report would ever fully capture. This is a moment in history that demands to be felt, not just studied. What does this pilot story stir in those watching right now? Drop thoughts, reflections, or simply a word in the comments below. These reactions from people across the world are what keeps stories like this one alive. The war ended. The sky went quiet. And that, for men like him, was sometimes the hardest part. There's a particular cruelty buried inside peacetime that history rarely examines with the same intensity it reserves for battles and campaigns. War, for all its horror, provides structure, purpose, a daily framework of mission and survival that organizes the human mind around something immediate and absolute. When that structure collapses, when the guns fall silent and the uniforms are folded away and the world begins a slow, awkward business of returning to normal, the men who carried the heaviest weight are often the least equipped for what comes next. He came home carrying 5 shoot-downs in his body and his memory. The medals came first. They always do, pinned with ceremony and photographed with handshakes. The institutional acknowledgement that something extraordinary had occurred. Crowds gathered. Newspapers carried his name for a brief and brilliant moment. The military, which had spent years sending him back into skies that repeatedly tried to kill him, now stood beside him in pressed uniforms and spoke about his courage in the polished language of official commendation. Then the crowds thinned. Then the newspapers moved on. And he was left alone with what 5 shoot-downs actually felt like from the inside. The physical toll was documented, incompletely, in medical records that prioritize return-to-duty assessments over long-term human consequence. The psychological toll was not documented at all. In the 1940s, the language to describe what sustained combat trauma does to a human nervous system barely existed in clinical settings, let alone in the vocabulary of military administration. Men were expected to readjust, to re-enter civilian life with the same quiet efficiency they had once brought to their cockpits. Some managed it. Many did not. What distinguished his story? What lifted it from personal tragedy towards something that history genuinely owes a debt to was a decision he eventually made to speak. Not immediately, not easily, but with the same stubborn refusal to disappear that had pulled him out of 5 burning aircraft over occupied Europe. He spoke about what the war had done, about the gap between the version of heroism that institutions celebrate and the version that lives inside the men who actually performed it. His account, raw, precise, and deeply human, became one of the earliest and most honest testimonies of what sustained aerial combat extracted from the people asked to conduct it. History nearly lost that testimony entirely. It survived, as he did, by the narrowest of margins, and that is perhaps the final lesson his story carries across the decades that separate his sky from this moment. Survival is not the end of the story. It is merely the condition required to finish telling it. The men and women who endured wars of that magnitude were not simply fighters. They were witnesses. And the greatest disservice any generation can commit is to let those witnesses fade into silence before the full weight of what they saw and survived has been properly heard. He was shot down 5 times. He came back 5 times. And every time history has threatened to forget him, someone, somewhere, has thought it worth the effort to bring him back once more. If this story landed with the weight it deserves, please consider sharing it with someone who loves real history. A parent, a grandparent, a friend who understands that the past is never truly past. Subscribing to WWII Ghost Wings takes only a moment, but means stories like this one will always find their way to those who need them most. And for the next story to watch, look for the video on the soldier who was officially declared dead 3 times and kept returning to the front line. It may be the most remarkable story on this entire channel. This has been WWII Ghost Wings. Until the next story, keep remembering,